there's something in the book, something for the reason that people went crazy. And I've had several people that read the first book and they talked about that technology that I bring up. And they said, yeah, well, that's scary because it's sort of here already. There's a lot of different ways you can end the world. I grew up with, worrying about nuclear war and then the EMPs and then there's all kinds of things, comets, whatever it is. But this would be something that could actually happen in the fairly near future.
This is the future.
Hello and welcome to the Alternate Futures podcast, where we chat with indie sci-fi creators about their work, the world, and anything in between or beyond. I'm your host, Edwin Rydberg, and today I'm here with Wayne Faust. Wayne is the author of 7 books, including the Calek's Tale trilogy, Tales from the Road short stories, and 30 Years Without a Real Job, along with over 50 short stories published in various places around the world. In addition to writing, he's been a full-time music performer, playing in 42 states as well as England, Holland, Scotland, and Mexico. He still plays ice hockey twice a week. Hi, Wayne. Thanks for joining me today.
Hey, good to talk with you, Edwin.
So first off, I guess, is the musician part. So you're a musician and you've been for quite a while. What got you started in that?
I started playing when I was in 6th grade, so like 12 years old. I got a guitar and played Beatles songs and all that kind of thing. But I always loved it. And I was doing shows all through grammar school and high school and in college especially. And it was sort of the folk days. So you'd write your own songs and people would listen to the words. And I was going to be a lawyer. I actually have a history degree in political science. And I thought, gee, I don't want to go to school for 2 more years. And I started hanging around at court cases and thought, I'm not really wired for this. And so as soon as I graduated, I started hanging out in the folk clubs in Chicago. And they would have these open mic nights where you go and do your own songs. You get to play 4 songs. You wait 2 hours through all these other acts. So you'd be nervous as heck. And then pretty soon I started getting gigs. And I said, I'm going to go for this. And so I started doing pretty good in Chicago. Then I moved to LA for 6 years and did the whole songwriting thing. I did okay. And then I got to Colorado, started doing opera ski shows. So I've mainly played resorts, but it's been a career for my whole life. That's why I wrote a book called 30 Years Without a Real Job, because it's been good. I've got to go to so many places and meet so many people. So that's my thing, music and comedy. I write a lot of funny songs and some nice ones as well.
So you have been able to make a living through music then?
Yep. Yeah, it wasn't easy. I can tell you some stories. The early days in the folk clubs, I went there. One place I played from 9 till 4 in the morning and I got $15, but I learned my trade and craft. And there's not much you could throw at me these days where I haven't seen it before. So I'm pretty experienced at it.
Yeah, the times of having to work your way up, basically, rather than hoping you start at well, everyone hopes they start at the top, but seems today they kind of expect to start at the top, don't they?
Yeah, and some of the people that said you can't do that for a living. Now, if I do a show for a big corporate thing and I make a lot of money for singing for an hour, they go, you got such an easy life. I go, yeah, but where were you when I was lugging my speakers up backstage smoky rooms and playing for 7 or 8 hours and nobody paying attention? So, you pay your dues.
Yeah, and that's very similar to writing as well, isn't it? Even the sort of A-list or traditionally published authors, they still have to pay their dues through often up to 10 years of just writing and writing and writing and working it through the industry, and finally someone catches them, boom, and all of a sudden, and we, the average reader, just sees success. Yay.
Yeah. We all have our walls papered with rejection slips. That's the difference between writing and performing. What did I pick for my next career after performing was one that's actually a lot harder than the first, because I can always, I never did this, but I could always just go into a bar and pick up my guitar and sing some songs and leave a hat out and make some money. But as far as I know, you can't go into a bar and start reading from your stories and try to get tips that way.
Yeah, the open mics aren't really a good opportunity for earning money in your hat.
No. As far as making a living or earning income with writing, you really have to be published and get people buy your stuff. So
yeah, because we do have a number of open mics where I live, but as far as I know, they don't put a hat out or anything. So
we didn't put a hat out when I did open mics, but I'm just talking about for trying to generate some income, supporting a family, and
yeah,
I got to get these gigs.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm curious, you mentioned going to LA. Were you writing songs for some of the big companies, or what was your experience there
I
like?
wish. Yeah, I wish, but but I learned my craft. I learned how the music business works. I worked with Mickey Rooney's wife and did a couple things. She was a country singer and got pretty close with a few of my songs, but I never wanted to spend my life out there. It's exciting for a few years, but it really didn't suit me well. I'm not really an LA kind of guy.
Yeah, I mean, here it's London. I think the young people like to go to London, try to make a name there, and then everyone in England, pretty much everyone will leave London eventually, moving out into the country and up
Yeah.
north to raise a family because London's too crazy.
Well, that's what I did. I live in the foothills above Denver and I have elk having babies in my backyard. And, it's a great place to raise a family and everything. So you have to juggle things between, your professional aspirations, but also having a life. So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I'm impressed that you still play ice hockey regularly.
yeah,
How's that going then? Keeps you in good
pretty
shape, I
good. My, my
imagine.
my
Yeah.
body's in decent shape, and I like to say I'm the old guy, but I'm slow. I like to tell everybody, but I get to play with my sons on one team, and then I play in an old guys league, and I just love it. It's my favorite sport, and it's my favorite thing to do. It's a wonderful workout. I always feel really good after games, even if we lose, because you're getting this great cardio workout, and it's exciting and fun, and I just love the sport of hockey.
Yeah, I'm impressed that you're still going without getting broken too much.
Yeah, I've been
It's
lucky.
not,
I broke an
yeah.
ankle the first year I played, but that was a long time ago, and I think I'm the old guy, and they don't try to take me out, so that's
Yeah.
okay.
So they'd be nice to, yeah, because it's not known as a gentle sport, is it?
No, no, but they say it's no checking, but people don't actually believe that very much. A
Yeah.
lot of elbowing and hacking and whacking, but they go after the fast guys usually, not so much me.
Yeah. So we'll get into Calek's tale shortly, but I wanted to bring up one thing was the setting is inspired by an island in the Great Lakes, which and that actually reminds me of home because I'm from northwestern Ontario, so the other side of the Great Lakes from where
Sure.
this was inspired. So what was your experience there that inspired you to set the story there?
I played a whole summer at the Mackinac Island, it's called, and they're famous because they don't allow cars. So you get off the ferry boat, and here goes a horse and a buggy, and anybody gets around with carriages, horse buggies, and bicycles. That's it, and it's like being in the 1800s. So that whole canvas of my Calek Tale stories are really it's pretty much based on Mackinac. It's not Mackinac, obviously, because they have electricity and everything else, but just the atmosphere with the woods and the lake and what the lake looks like in the wintertime. I went to school in Kenosha, Wisconsin, so I know what Lake Michigan looks like in the winter when it's frozen over, and you got these ice piles and all these things. So I used all of that detail as the canvas for my stories.
Well, that's excellent. I'm curious. So, what inspired you to add novel writing to your repertoire when music wasn't challenging enough, I guess, to make a living?
I wasn't quite that, but the short stories came first. And I've always loved writing, especially speculative, sci-fi and what if kind of stories. And so I had a dream probably 20 years ago. So this one short story ends up being a short story. And it was an image from the end of the story. Turned out to be a werewolf story, go figure. But I pictured this last scene of the thing. And so I said, that would make a great story. So I sat down and started writing. Now, the interesting thing is, writers will appreciate this. I've been writing songs since I was in sixth grade, and you got to say everything you need to say in three verses. So when I started writing this story, well, first I went to an adult education class to learn how to format, how to do all these different things, and I'm a very visual writer, so that came pretty easy. But then so I joined a writers group, and the guy who ran that writers group was Edward Bryant, who was a pretty well-known sci-fi writer for years. We lost him about 10 years ago, but he was the leader of the group, and I started writing, and I got to a page and a half, and I was like, oh, this is getting way too long, this is really boring. So and he told me, let the story write itself. So I had to learn how to do that, but it was a real joy to learn how to just be able to just, I don't have to rhyme things, I don't have to do all these other things. And so I started doing that, and then eventually I started getting acceptances on a lot of stories, and I've had some pretty good success with my short stories. There have been 50 of them in different places. I had one translated into Norwegian, which was pretty cool, for a Pegasus magazine. And my brother translated it back for me because he knows Swedish. And it was funny to see what my words sounded like after it had been translated twice. It was pretty interesting. And so I started doing short stories, and then I started the Calek novel probably 10 years ago. I just started, and it ended up being 3 books. And I just loved writing it because I would, in the summertime, I play in Missouri, and I go out on my bicycle and just to get exercise. And I would get these inspirations like, oh, what if this character did this? What if this? And I couldn't wait to get back to the condo to and it really developed. And I don't know if I'll be able to write anything that good anymore in my life because when I read it all over, after all the time I spent on it, it really works. So that's how I ended up with novels. But otherwise, it's mostly short stories.
Do you still write both music and prose sort of at the same, more or less the same time? Like, how do you switch back and forth in your mindset between them?
Yeah, it's two very different things, of course. Yeah, and of course, I write a lot of little ditties for my music and funny songs, and I do a corporate show and I make up a little song about them and whatever I do. As far as the writing now, I've been really concentrating on trying to get Calek promoted and get it out there in the world. So I haven't done as much writing now, but I've got some ideas percolating, and I'll sit down soon.
So I'm curious, what type of music do you write typically?
Well, it's interesting because I'm kind of a hybrid. I write a lot of funny songs and I have parodies. I had a song that they played on the radio in Northern Ireland called Mad Cow. If you know the downtown song, if you're in England and you think you might want to have a burger there, Mad Cow, and it goes on from there. It's actually very funny, but and I still get listens on Spotify with that one. But I have a lot of songs like that. I have one of my popular ones called "I'm Schizophrenic, So Am I." And I have "Save the Beer," is all about these guys on a boat in Lake Erie, which is like Ontario there, and a bunch of guys and a bunch of beer on the boat. And here comes the Hooters waitresses, and they got to decide between the beer or the Hooters, and you know what they pick. A lot of songs like that, but also some real sensitive, sweet songs that because I was a folkie, and I always like the real pretty acoustic songs. I have a song called "Sailing Home," and I just last couple of months I've had 20,000 streams on Spotify, which is nothing like the guy with the farting frog song or something, but it works for me. And so I have some of those too. So my shows are like that. I do lots of comedy, make everybody laugh, but then I can always shift gears. And so that's the kind of music that I do. It's guitar and banjo. I play banjo. I do some bluegrass, a lot of sing-alongs. I play keyboards as well on my recordings and bass.
So that seems like a strange combination to lead into science fiction. So I'm just
Yeah,
curious how
yeah.
where the interest in science fiction came from.
Well, I always loved it growing up. My favorite show was The Twilight Zone, which I think probably a lot of people from my generation were that way. I got to meet Rod Serling. He came to speak at college. He had a lecture called "The 20th Century and Other Absurdities." And he's a little short guy. I got to shake his hand. He's only was only 5'4" or something, but he was one of my heroes. He's a wonderful writer. But I love science fiction stories that are not necessarily hard sci-fi, but the stories that are really about the people and the emotions and how they deal with whatever the future, the aliens, whatever it is. And the best stories are like that. Of course, I love Lord of the Rings and those kind of things. I was a fan of Harry Potter books, all of those. If you can come up with a whole nother world. So it really didn't have anything to do with my music. I was a fan of Harry Chapin. He did Cats in the Cradle and Taxi and some of those. But he had these long story songs that were very heavy, really deep. And I used to sing a lot of those in my shows in the coffee houses. And so I wrote some of those songs. I would have these long songs with really intricate kind of plots and surprise, like what can happen to this guy. So I was sort of wired for that. So when I started writing, seems like the natural thing for me was that speculative, but it is very different. I had to try to sell the idea to some of my fans of my music because, like, okay, this isn't my comedy and music show. Although I've written some funny stories as well.
Yeah, because you have a what seems like a more traditional style science fiction one. Again, we'll get into Calex's
Yeah.
Tale in a moment, but you have a Europa Nightmare, and
Oh
which is
yeah, that's one with
co-written,
another.
right? And
Yeah, that's another guy. Yeah.
so I mean, that one was earlier, right?
Yeah, I was sort of in the mist. He was in my writers group, and Chuck is like a military space guy and aliens and all of that. So, but we came up with a pretty good novel, I think. But it's very different than what I usually do.
So that was the outlier one then. Have you thought to go back
Yeah,
to that?
yeah. We tried to write book two, but it's funny because Chuck is one of these guys that just keeps on going off in these really weird directions, and it was up to me to rein it in. Like he came to me the first book, and he goes, "Would you write the last 90 pages? Because I have no idea what to do with this, you know." So, which I did, and I think it came out pretty well. So then we tried to start a second book, and it was just too chaotic, so we gave it up. But we might one day.
So do you have a regular writing routine then? Because I mean, you have your prose, and then obviously you have your music as well to make a living, and your road shows, which interrupt that as well.
Yeah, so it depends what I'm doing. If I'm working on a book or stories, and I I'm one of these guys that gets inspiration and then I sit down, and once it's going, I really want to keep going and finish it. But I've done that before where I said, okay, I'm going to write for an hour every day and about nothing, just write a story about what's outside my window. Um, and that's helped really well. So I need to be more disciplined. So thank you for bringing that up. So I should probably do that again soon.
It's something all of us face, I think.
Yeah.
I definitely do as well. I mean, so with your music, you've been out there a lot performing, so you have no trouble bringing your music to the public. So I'm curious, when you started writing prose, did you have the feeling that you wanted to publish things right away, or was that something that you just sort of went with as the story developed and you're like, hey, maybe this is something I should put out there?
Well, with short stories, I made sure that I didn't self-publish anything. I needed the validation from a publisher. And so that's why I got all those rejection slips. It's just amazing how many you get. But once I started getting acceptances, and then all my short stories have been published with different, I never quite cracked the big ones, Sci-Fi Magazine or some of those. You get the rejections from them in about a half an hour. It's really interesting. It's like, oh yeah, you really wrote that story, didn't you? But I'm used to that from trying to get songs out there. So, but then with the novel, then finally, I thought Calek was a good enough thing that I'm just going to go ahead and publish this. So I use Picklehead, or actually Paintbrush Press, I think is what I used. But that's my own company, so that's a self published. But it's doing real well. I mean, the reviews have been great, and a lot of my music fans. Quite a few people said after the first book, they said we read it in one sitting and we can't wait for the next one. And so I think it's really got a future.
Yeah, I'd agree. It does catch you for sure. So I'm curious, when you were writing it, did you outline it? Like, did you have a decent outline of where it went in your head, or did you just kind of write as the character? Because you mentioned earlier, sort of, you'd be sitting there and thinking, oh, well, that character could do this. And so was it kind of just going where the characters took you in the general framework of the story, or did you outline it fairly tightly?
That's a great question. A lot of people, there's two schools, people that say you need to have it all laid out and then actually just fill in the gaps. I'm one of those guys that I knew, like the first book, I knew where it was going to end and I knew where it started. And then after that, I kept adding these different things. And that was the real joy, the exciting part for me is that, oh, I can't, Kayla's going to do this and Hezekiah's going to do this. And oh, yeah. And that's what really made it fun for me. I mean, I would wake up in the middle of the night and go, oh, yeah, I got to get this down. This is really good. And then I'm a very meticulous writer. Like in the writers group, people would submit things with all kinds of typos and tense changes and all these things. But I edit as I go along and I read it out loud to myself, which I think is one of the best tools for a writer is to read it out loud. And then I read it to my wife out loud because then you catch all the things about, I have a feeling that I want to convey, and that's how I do it, just to capture what I'm trying to say and what I'm trying to do. So that's how I write.
Right. That kind of leads into the audiobook as well, because of course, if you read it out loud, then you can get a better feel for when how the audiobook will sound. So what was that process like? Because I actually listened to the audiobook because it's
Oh, you
more
did good.
convenient for me. And I really enjoyed it. I thought it was done really well and it captured the feel quite well. So did you hire someone for that? Did you go out
Yes.
specifically and find, so what services did you use for that? How did you produce that?
So I'm really glad you asked that because that's a real joy of mine. A lot of my stories have been done on stage. There's a thing called One Night Stand Theater in Denver. And what they do is stage readings and they get authors. And then what they do is they have professional actors that come up there and they read your stories. And sometimes it'll be different voices or whatever. And there's a guy named Guy Williams that has done quite a few of my stories. And I love his voice. And he works for Talking Books in Denver. So he's been doing it for 20 or 30 years. And so I hired him to come up to my studio. I have a studio in my house, and I hired him to come up and record them. And man, I tell you, I can't tell you what that feels like when you put your blood and sweat into a story and then you hear somebody read it and really bring it to life. He does the voices, he does everything. If you listen to the audiobook, you know what I'm talking about. And then when he would be doing it, there'd be times tears would be coming down my eyes, or I'd get chills. And man, and he's such a pro. He rarely had to do second takes or anything. So he did all three of the Caleb books, and then he did my short story books. It was even more fun because that's all different characters and different voices, and he's just such a pro. He's really good. So that was really a labor of love for me to this Guy Williams. So I already knew who I wanted to do it, and I paid him to come up. So that's how we did
Yeah,
it.
that's pretty awesome because one of the things with audiobooks I find, I mean, there was a time when it was largely just narrated which was, you listen and it's just like someone reading it to you normally. And I don't really like those kind of audiobooks. I really do appreciate when there's someone who can bring it to life with the voices. And I think it's a great idea to have an open mic where sort of professional, semi-professional voice actors read out the pieces, because authors tend not to be able to read their own stuff very well unless they have a performance background.
Yeah, and I have a performance background, but I'm not a narrator. And on my Tales from the Road short story, the stories are strung together from a road trip to Key West, which I did for about 20 years with a partner of mine. Every 6 weeks, every spring, we drive from Denver to Key West, which is 42 hours. And so I strung the stories together with little vignettes in between, like now we're in Hays, Kansas, and it's 2 a.m. and this is what it looks like. And I read those for the book, but it's just because it's my voice and I'm saying what we did. But really, I'm not good at voices for narrating. I don't have a radio voice. Right now, I don't have much of a voice at all, but normally I have, a decent voice, a performer's voice, but not for narrating books. So I really wanted to hire somebody else. And I know what you're saying. I love audiobooks. I do more of those than anything else because I'm in the car so much. And one of my favorite memories was years and years ago, going down to Key West. I had Lord of the Rings on cassette. It was like each one was like 25 cassettes for each book. And I remember driving across Kansas at 2 o'clock in the morning, where Frodo and Sam are going up Mount Doom, and they had this lovely British narrator, and he's doing all the voices and stuff. And it's 2 a.m, and my eyes are wide open. I'm hanging onto my steering wheel. I could just picture everything. It was just fantastic. I knew it was going to happen because I had read the books, but there's just something magic about somebody doing the voices and bringing it to life with
Yeah,
the
no.
accents, the whole thing.
And it is great because, like you say, you can, some people will say, "Oh, you have to read the book," but at least you can experience the book while doing other things.
I'm
As
one of those guys that believes that doing the audiobook, as long as it's unabridged, feels in my head like I actually read it. Now, the purists say, no, you didn't really read the book, but to me, I read it. So the
yeah, I
more I
mean,
listen to it,
life gets busier and busier, and you have to find ways to incorporate everything, don't you? So you made a trailer for book two, I noticed on your website.
yep.
What was the process for that like?
Well, unfortunately, somebody wanted to promote book two, and I don't know. We get all these things now. People want to promote your books, and they charge you money for it. And this one, I think it was probably maybe a scam. I don't know. When I was supposed to do one of these, like I'm doing with you, and she was supposed to call me for a Zoom thing, and she said, you need a trailer, but we'll do it for you. And then she sent me a trailer, and it wasn't very good. It was the characters were nothing like Calek, and it was cheesy, And I said, well, I'll do the trailer. And so then I did the trailer, and it came out pretty nice. It's like 2 minutes long. But then the meeting never came through. And she said, oh, yeah, we introduced you to our book club, and they really liked it. Of course, I got no results. So I thought, this is not a bad idea to have a trailer. So if nothing else, she inspired me to do that. And I'll probably put together a couple for 1 and 3 because I do a lot of graphics. I run a website called Picklehead Music, and I do my own album covers, and I really enjoy that end of things. And I'm doing another YouTube video right now. I have about 25 videos on YouTube with my songs, and I'm doing a new one now. And it's a fun process, and you can do so much nowadays with computer and AI and all of that.
Yeah, we'll get into the double-edged sword of technology in relation to your book as well. But speaking of those book club emails, those book club scam emails, I had a whole bunch of them for a while. There was a period of a couple months where I was just getting them constantly. And initially I hadn't heard of this as a scam. So the first one came through and they just asked, "Oh, we've discovered your book and we'd like to discuss it at our book club. Could you give us some more information?" I'm like, "Okay, fine." So I wrote them up something. And then they're asking for a little bit more. And then eventually it got to the point where it's like, "Okay, could you donate a little bit of money to the," and I'm like, "What book club asks you for money, right?"
Right.
And then it started, especially because they're like, "Well, we just needed to sort of help fund the event." I'm like, "Hey, you haven't told me about any event. You haven't invited me to any event." And
Yeah.
so it was pretty clear at that point it was a scam. And then I just kept getting these emails for a while and didn't bother responding. And now they've kind of stopped, but it's very strange.
Yeah, I got burned twice, and that's enough. Okay, I spent enough money on something that didn't, and I run ads with things, and some of them pay off real well. All of a sudden, they get 50, 75 sales, from them, and you don't mind paying for those. But those things that they word them, they use AI to write, and it sounds so, wow, that's really, they really love my book. That's a great description of what's in there, and they say this would be great for this market or whatever, and it sounds really legit, but they aren't.
Yeah. So on that note, how has your marketing experience been for Calek's Tale?
Well, we're getting there. Originally, I got a lot of sales right away because from fans, I have a lot of fans, and they bought it and told other people, and so I sort of used up the bubble of my fan base, and then of course you want to leap to the next level. So it's a process, and you get really. I remember when writers on Reddit, it was a writers symposium, and one goes, "Isn't there anybody out there that's legit?" Because there's so many that, and I get them. Not getting so many now because I haven't been. I just delete them and mark them as spam. But it's, as you know, it's a, like I said, what did I pick for my next career was something that's actually way harder than the music business. And the music business has a lot of the same things because you would send songs in, and I can tell you stories about LA where you'd have these nights where there'd be a publisher and they're looking for songs for somebody, whatever kind of song it was. And you would literally you do a demo of your song on a cassette, and they would put it in a big roulette wheel in front of a couple hundred people, spin it, and then they pull the song out and play it. And then the publisher would say whether they would jump all over it probably, but they listened to like 10 seconds of it. And then I learned that the only ones that they picked up were ones that sounded exactly like something that was just on the radio, that week. And so I know how the process works, and I'm sure slush piles are like that with publishers where they read the first page and go, no, that's not going to work. So I really know about rejection, and you have to just have a thick skin and just keep going.
Yeah, it's one of the things with marketing. So I mean, I did some anthologies where I had submissions come in. This was back 15 years ago or something. And so I kind of got in a little bit of taste of both sides, being a writer and also being the publisher in that way. And then also sort of studying agents and things like that back in the day. And yeah, I mean, the marketing department has a big role to play, obviously. Like you say, they really want to get stuff that's similar to something that's popular at the moment. And then the other hand is you also have, the agents and editors who have their own preferences. I mean, I have a pretty narrow preference of stuff I really like to read. And if it doesn't match that, then I don't particularly enjoy reading it. If you're an editor or an agent with that kind of view, you're going to probably reject a lot of high quality stuff.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate. Yeah.
I learned it from both sides too, because Pickle had music. My old partner and I we marketed funny songs, and then the word got around, and we kept getting all this stuff from people, and it's really interesting because one thing I learned, like there was one act, and I didn't think much of it, and so I rejected. I usually tried to be a kind rejector, and say, that you keep going, some pretty good stuff. But then I listened to that stuff again like a couple of months later, and I was in a different mood, and I really liked it.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's depending on what they're thinking that day, how busy they are. So I was so jealous. I playing down in Key West. If you ever heard of Shel Silverstein, he was a wonderful writer, kids books, and then he wrote Cover of the Rolling Stone and the Unicorn Song and all. He lived in Key West, and I got to know him, and I went to his house one afternoon. And he came out of the house with this notebook because he did his pictures and poems and music. And he was an amazing guy. But he had a notebook stuffed with all these things that he hadn't had published yet. And I said, well, how do you get your stuff out there? He goes, well, I got people that do that for me. And when he died, his son got $25 million. So he was very successful. But he had people that did that. And I'm jealous of that. I really am, because I love the creating. But as you know, the marketing is like bookkeeping more than anything, to try to keep track of where you send it and what people have said. And sometimes people say, especially with songs, they'll send me something in 6 months because so-and-so is going to be recording. Maybe they'll be interested. So you'd have to write that down and keep track of it all. And so I'm jealous of those people. I really am. But, if you want to get it out there, you still got to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Get to the point where you can get a team to do the work for you, I guess.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Yeah. It's interesting. So regarding the moods and stuff, I completely agree with that. And to the point when I was doing it, I had it was basically a volunteer group we got from one of the writing websites. And so I brought in like 4 or 5 people to read stuff as well, because I know that I'm quite narrow in some of the stuff I like, and hopefully they can sort of balance that out as well. So I usually try, and I wish maybe more agents had a team as well to balance stuff out, but it's ultimately the marketing departments, really. So
well, the best thing was like with songs, if you can get somebody to say, hey, listen to this, I mean, if you send things in cold, they got slush, so like if you're in the music business, if you can somehow get, have a beer with Randy Travis's agent or something and then play a song and he really likes it, he's going to go to Randy and say, "Oh, listen to this. This might be good for you." That's usually the way that things happen. I mean, that's not the only way, but that's your best chance. And I'm sure it's the same with books, is that, get somebody to read it. But it's a little harder to get somebody to read a whole book than it is to listen
Listen
to a
to this.
3 minute
Yeah,
song.
exactly. Yeah. That's probably
That's
why
why I said it's a harder.
the
Yeah,
first page is
that's
so
why.
important, right? Yeah.
Yeah, oh, yeah, and you always want to have a zinger right off the bat, and
Yeah.
like especially with those songs in LA, they listen to 10 seconds of it, and I had this one where it was at the Comedy Store in LA. I have a song called "Welcome to the World," my little one, after I wrote after my first son was born, and it's got a little baby crying, and it's pretty, and then so the guy up front, the publishers, he's kind of belittling it, going, "Huh, what am I going to use this for? St. Jude's Hospital, and stuff." And then I looked down the row and there's a woman sitting there and she was crying when she heard the song. So I said, she liked it. And
Yeah.
then so you have to take those, there's like a rejection bank that you have. I've had that my whole life. And it's like when something good and you really made a difference with somebody with your stories or your song, whatever it is, you put that in your rejection bank in the middle of your chest. And then when somebody doesn't like it, you go, yeah, but those other people did. So I'm going to keep going. So it's a hard thing.
Yeah, and then the trends swing around, don't they?
Oh yeah,
Depending on who's in the industry and things like that as well,
correct.
what's popular and everything. So maybe it comes
Correct.
back and suddenly it
Yeah, you just got to
becomes,
do what
yeah.
you do. But when you said my stuff is maybe more traditional sci-fi or whatever, you just have to write what's out there, good. And like I said, it's interesting with the music too, because there's a lot of things that are like Willie Nelson had something like 50 albums that didn't sell well at all. And then Urban Cowboy came around and he was still doing his Willie Nelson thing. And of course he got huge. So you gotta just keep hanging in there.
Yeah, that was the famous J.K. Rowling story as well, isn't it? With her massive rejection slips before it got picked
Oh
up.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. My other favorite one is The Killer Angels. I love history and I read a lot of history. And Killer Angels is a Civil War book, and it got a Pulitzer Prize, but he tried to get it published for 25 years because nobody wants to read Civil War books. And then that came out. And then after he died, his son took up the tales and stuff, but it was a wonderful book. But he couldn't get it published for the longest time. It wasn't because it wasn't any good. It's just that he didn't find the right situation. But it just really is about, I tell singers, millions of people didn't like Elvis. I didn't like him. I wasn't an Elvis fan. So should Elvis have said, "Well, Wayne Faust doesn't like me. I guess I suck."
Yeah.
That's ridiculous, obviously, but that's really what it is. You have to find your audience and do what you believe in.
Yeah, I think that's the key, finding your audience, because there's so many different books these days
Mm.
and a lot of good quality books that just aren't what the big companies want. So you put them out and you have to look for your audience. And that leads well, I think, into your book, which is the
Hey, hooray!
the Calek Tale trilogy. And so I guess I give a quick summary, which is basically that the story we already mentioned takes place on an island, which is essentially a religious commune, kind of has an Amish sort of feel to it. And it's in a kind of collapsed world. And it centers around Calek, who is he's 11 at the beginning of the story. And he sort of
It turns 12. Yeah, it
it
turns
turns
12.
12 during the story. Yeah. And he's highly intelligent, but doesn't really understand what's happening in the world. So there's this conflict that builds up. So the commune is led by Hezekiah, and he's an interesting character, and we want to get into that in a little bit. And so fundamentally, this is what I class as a walled city class of story. So it's on an island, so there's effectively a moat between them and the real world. And this type of story is typically used to explore tradition versus progress, which is what you've done in a very interesting way. Is there anything you wanted to add to the summary? I didn't give a very broad summary, but I don't want to give away too many spoilers either.
Yeah, I will say that something really bad happened on the mainland 12 years ago. In fact, right after Caleb was born, and something really bad happened. And there was these people called the Forsaken. Like it seems like the whole world went crazy, but that's what he's heard. And they invaded the island, and the Forsaken were I want that. I want that. Whatever they wanted, there was no, it's sort of like no conscience, no anything. And they're not zombies, but I mean, they sort of act that way. And then they were fought off with some loss of life. Hezekiah organized his men and they fought him off. And that's what he's been told, but he doesn't know if it's really true. It's like, are these fairy tales or that he's just trying to keep people under like this? Calek's a very smart boy, and he loves to invent things. He has this great talent for taking things and putting them together. But that sort of starts to run afoul of Hezekiah to give you an idea. And this was really early in the book, so it's not a spoiler. That they had Heaven's Way as the main street of Refuge is the name of the town, and then so it keeps on, with the northern Great Lakes, so it freezes and thaws, and so there's a lot of potholes and washboard type of thing. And Calek figured out there's some tar pits on the other side of the island. If you take this tar and you melt it down and make it smooth, we could actually make a road, and it wouldn't do that. And then so he does that, and then the island decides this is a pretty good idea. Hezekiah doesn't think he wants that, but they allow him to do that. Already there's like a red flag with Hezekiah because they say the old world was evil. Everything was evil, the technology, all of it. And then and Caleb, he's clueless about this. He just loves this stuff. And in the very, very beginning, he sees a leaf coming down and he watches the birds and he goes, if I could come up with a carriage, it would have like wings and it would go forward fast enough, maybe I get something to fly. And that gets him in a lot of trouble when he starts talking like that. And then so you really don't know when you're reading the book, did something really happen on the mainland? And if it did, what was it like and why did it happen? But the main plot of all three books is Hezekiah versus Calek. And then of course there's Calek's dad and then Hezekiah's wife. And there's lots of spiritual undertones. There's a lot of that between like Old Testament, New Testament type thinking, that sort of thing.
Right, because I mean, I guess it's pretty early on as well that Hezekiah is a religious leader, but you set him up in a very interesting way because he set up the commune essentially before the collapse, didn't he? And he actually did. So he's shown as being quite a, now it's hard to say how manipulative this is, but he seems to be a very caring person. He has saved most of the people in the commune from horrors or at least bad things in their original life, so that they do feel a loyalty to him because of that. And so that was a very strong, valid way of forming a bond with these people. And I think it's really interesting how you set up, like you mentioned earlier, it's tradition versus progress, but there's positives on both sides that are shown, and the negatives on both sides we get implied as well. And I think it was a very strong way of setting that up as well.
Well, thank you. And then when you have a protagonist, I mean, the black and white stories are just like the bad guy's always really bad. I mean, there's a reason these people followed Hezekiah to the island. He did a lot of wonderful things for him. But if you're Calek, it's like, wait a minute, no, you're not going to let me do this. And Calek likes to explore the caves on the island, and he keeps looking for evidence of the old world. Like, what was it really like? And could they do things like that? Could they have carriages that would fly, and could they whatever? And of course, all of that is poo-pooed. But yeah, Hezekiah is definitely a deep character. I mean, there's a lot of things come out. I use a lot of flashbacks where you think this is this way, and then all of a sudden you do a flashback from 5 years ago or before. The chapters are divided into before the fall, during the fall, and after the fall. They call it the fall. It happened 12 years ago. And so, yeah, there's a lot of depth to Hezekiah. And either you love him at first or you hate him, or I had a guy call me. I won't tell you any more about chapters because I don't want any spoilers, but a fan from Chicago, he was in tears and he said, because there was a chapter with Hezekiah helping one of the people that just came to the island. And he said, Wayne, he said, you're my Hezekiah. He said, because I wrote that chapter and it really captured what happened to him with his own father. And I was like, yikes, I don't know if he wants to read the rest of this book or not, but
Yeah.
I thought that was nice that it touched him that way, that he, thought enough that he was emotional about it and wanted to call me on the phone. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm actually quite curious whether you go further into Hezekiah's background in future books, because you do go a little bit into his background with relation to his family. But it seems like he must have a strong psychology background or something. I don't know. I'm very curious how he developed between the points, the family parts we saw of him in the story and the person he became when he became Hezekiah. There's in the first book there's a gap there, so I'm hoping that you develop that a bit more in the future books as well.
I'm thinking that you read the first book, right? You haven't read the other two
Just
yet?
the first book, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, you'll be interested to see
Okay, that's good. Yeah,
what goes on with Hezekiah.
without spoilers.
That's
Yeah,
all I'll say. But I do have well, part of the background. There's a spiritual element of it, and
yeah,
I'm a Christian guy. But I read, put it this way, and I mentioned it after the end of the third book. I read a book called Kingdom of the Cults, and about cult leaders, and I've always been fascinated by that. The whole, Heaven's Gate and the whole Jim Jones and all that. Like, why do people follow these guys? And so there's a lot of elements of Hezekiah that are from that, because Hezekiah thinks he's speaking for God, and he
right. The
thinks, oh, look,
chosen
they brought us
one.
here, we saved us all. So he doesn't think he's a villain, and so there's a lot of depth. It gets into a lot more in the second and third book. You'll see some of that, fleshes a lot of that out. But the first book has to set the table, and then hopefully provide a nice cliffhanger at the end. So
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things of his journey and the strength of his character is that I mean he feels he's the chosen one basically, and that
mhm.
he's acting to save his people, and that's a very powerful motivator. And then yet at the same time we do see fairly early on some cracks forming, and by the end of the book we see more cracks in that, which become more openly challenged. And I think that's a really interesting way to set up a character like that because it's very easy to write them one dimensionally. And so I guess, yeah, that was a question I was going to have maybe a little bit later, but seems to fit now is how did you manage this balancing of the two sides without sort of straw manning one side? Because it's very easy to straw man one of the arguments.
That's an excellent question as well. I think I've always loved books where the characters are fully fleshed out. And so I try to get into the head of each character that I write. So Hezekiah had to get into his head. Now, what would he do and why would he do it? Now, not just like, okay, I'm just want to be in charge of everything. It's hard to put this into words, but he he believes in everything he's doing. He believes in his theology, and it did save the people. When you get into the book, I mean, the reason those people are alive is because they came to the island with him. So that gives him an awful lot of power. Like anything else he says down the road, if you were right, like say all these, I think part of the what if of this whole series is, and of course, sci-fi writers love what ifs. I think that's one of the most powerful questions in any stories. But my thought in this one, what if the guy in the street corner with a sign saying, the end is near,
Yeah, yeah.
or what if the guys had predicted that, the world, I'm old enough to remember a lot of predictions where this was going to happen. People were selling houses and doing, but what if those guys turn out to be right? So anything they say from then on, people are going to have to say, well, he was right before about this. So I guess we better follow him and pretty much do whatever he says, even if there's something that he says, like, this doesn't seem right. I got a conscience here and this isn't right. I don't think we need to do that. But you always come back to, well, he was right about this other thing. So God must be on this guy's side. And so that was sort of the underlying question with Hezekiah in all these books. And
Yeah,
is how far can he take that?
yeah, because that is quite powerful, like you say. Like he was right, and he did save all these people, and that's obviously a lot of positive currency in the social bank for him,
Mhm.
and for the whole debate of the two sides as well. And it was interesting because you mentioned, I guess 2012 was when we really saw that last, which wasn't actually that long ago, was it? People
No,
worrying about the end of the world and selling their homes and everything. Yeah,
no.
didn't come
Yeah, there's
true
been some
then.
crazy ones though. Remember the one where the guy was selling this, I mean, these things you go, how could people follow this? But people do. But the one where he was selling, he was going to put people in this spaceship and shrink them down to these little people, and then he's launch them up to some spacecraft and save them and take them to a new planet. And he would open the box and there'd be little things in there, and people would send him thousands of dollars so they could be one of those people, And of course, it's ridiculous, but there's ones that are a lot more. I mean, Jim Jones was presumably charismatic, and he got people to go for it. And the whole thing about revelations, if you believe that that particular person is speaking directly from God, and whenever they say, I got a revelation, everybody's like, oh my gosh, we better listen because this is right from God through this guy. And once you give that person that power, Boy, that's pretty huge.
Yeah. And I guess it all starts from, I mean, I'm not challenging any religion particularly here, but we do accept quite often a lot of the religions, and then elements of those get taken and I'll just say molded into other versions. Like if you mentioned Heaven's Gate, and as far as I understand it, the idea was basically, well, we need to die to get to heaven, so we're just going to speed up the process, basically, right?
Yeah,
And you're
yeah,
like, well, the logic isn't inherently flawed
yeah,
if you kind of ignore other parts of the scripture, perhaps, right? And the same
yeah.
thing kind of with Scientology. I've spent a lot of time because it's features in one of my books, which isn't published yet. But the idea that it's a very weird structure, and I know that the whole religion is quite strange, but he's taken fundamental elements from things like Christianity and he's extrapolated them into a science fiction story and then based a religion around that, right? Which is,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
it's really interesting. We do have that. But what I was wondering with your story then, because as I mentioned, I kind of put this in the walled city class of story, which quite often are alien stories or they're in far future. And what made you set your story in what it would be the believably near future?
Because there's something in the book. I don't know how to do this without a spoiler, but there's something for the reason that people went crazy, in the world.
Yeah,
That when
yeah,
people went crazy and led to the Forsaken. And that technology is already here. I mean, it's not far off at all. And I've had several people that read the first book and they talked about that technology that I bring up. And they said, yeah, well, that's scary because it's sort of here already. There's a lot of different ways you can end the world. I grew up with, worrying about nuclear war and then the EMPs and then there's all kinds of things, comets, whatever it is. But this would be something that could actually happen in the fairly near future. So that's why I said it when I did. There's no timeline. There's no dates or anything in the book,
right.
except that Hezekiah calls the year zero, the year everything happened. And then of course they're in the year 12 or 13, whatever it is. They have their own timekeeping, but I don't really give a clue as like this is 2040 or whatever it is.
I'm trying not to give any spoilers as well, but I did want to touch on that because it's interesting. So I can see that, like you say, it's a very believably close future, and
Mhm.
you can see it even with the people in play right now in the world that are this was I don't know. Can we reasonably say this was a technology thing without
Yeah,
spoiling?
there was an advance in technology.
Yeah, and it's not that far in the future, as you said, and you can see like I have a company in mind when I listened to this that I was like, okay, I could see that company doing this perhaps for well-intended corporate purposes, not well-intended social purposes, but but
Yeah,
triggering something like this without thinking of the consequences, and the whole thing goes wrong, right?
right, right.
Um, so it's quite an interesting one, and very very frightening. It reminded me a little bit of a scene in Ready Player One, the general
So that's a
idea.
great book.
Yeah, so I'm thinking the movie
Yeah,
specifically where the what was his name, Sorrento, is trying to sell the Oasis to the board, Oasis 2.0, and he's saying, what did he say? Something like, we can sell 80% of the visual space of the player without inducing seizures, basically. So, and that there is a lot of that in corporations that we don't hear about, right? So
right.
even in certain ideological policies within the airline companies, for example, it's come out, all right, well, what is the acceptable casualty rate for this policy, basically, right? And
Hmm.
you're like, well, it should be zero, but
Yeah,
but it's obviously not for the company, and that's kind of frightening because you've mentioned a little bit what it is. You mentioned, they don't basically have I guess an inhibitory filter on their desires, if that's not too much of a spoiler, because you mentioned I want this, I want that.
when it's something with the brain, that's all I'll say. But the other thing, this is a little bit of a tangent, but what I will say, in spite of all the discussion about technology and everything, what I hope makes these books work, and I think that do, and the responses I've gotten is the characters and to
Right,
getting
yeah.
involved. You really care what happens to Calek, and you really care what happens to Hezekiah's wife, and especially Calek's dad, because he loves his son, but then he also believes in Hezekiah. So what's he going to do? Those kind of things. And in spite of all the really cool philosophical and technological things in these books, the reason we love Lord of the Rings is because we really love Frodo. We really want this guy to make it. And so hopefully that'll be what people come away from when they read these books.
Yeah, oh, definitely. Yeah.
I,
Yeah, and the
uh,
key thing is it's very believable, right? Like
yeah,
anyone reading this can see, like you could set this 5 years in the future and people would be like, yeah, I could see that. Like,
yeah, yeah.
which is a frightening part.
And
Yeah.
I have a fondness for that part of the world. If you grew up, because I don't know if it's a spoiler if I tell them you grew up in Ontario, but uh, it's I love the North Woods, and to me that was like I get to live in the Rocky Mountains now, but I love the North Woods, and to me that was like paradise, around the Great Lakes, and I do shows up there, and to go on Mackinac Island, and that's what I really like. I play in Key West and do all these other things, but they call that paradise. But to me, it's not being on a beach and under a palm tree; it's in the woods and the mountains and all of that. So I think I captured that in the books, what it feels like to be up there, to live like and all the different changes in the seasons. It goes through the whole gamut during the books. Some books are like that. They take us somewhere. So hopefully it'll take
Yeah,
people there.
definitely. It reminded me of two places. So I definitely had the feeling of home, as you mentioned. So Northwestern Ontario, which is fairly close to where it was inspired by. And then also for
Yeah,
some reason I had a view of West Coast Canada, and I'm not really sure why, but I had that in my head
could
as
be.
well. So yeah, it was interesting. But yeah, you do, as you said, the characters are what brings any story alive, and it's very interesting because within the characters you approach a lot of the conflicts that exist. One of them is with regards to Calek. So he's the one navigating this space between the two worlds, the traditional world and the progress. And he is confused because he doesn't basically have enough information. And for me, this is interesting because this is a challenge of teaching the young, right? And so my daughter's now getting ready for university, but I was a primary care, so we had a lot of conversations going to school, and I'd watch her in the playgrounds and stuff. And I was very surprised when she was young because I'm not someone who grew up really, eager to have kids or anything. So I wasn't really thinking about how I'd raise a child, right? But when I saw her within, her peer groups and in primary school, there was just a sudden sort of awareness of how this fits together and things you have to be careful with, but also things, you can't withhold too much, but you can't give them too much information until they're ready. One of the things with the heavily traditional world in the book is they have a coming of age ceremony,
Mhm.
really, let's say, told more or less what happens. But it doesn't reach Calek in time, right? Obviously, because he's 12, as
Right.
we mentioned in the book. And this is, for me, it's one of those things where you give the child the information when they're ready for it, right? But it's one of those challenges. So if you stick strictly to traditional guidelines, you end up with problems because the kids who are ready for it earlier don't get the information they need. And so that's another challenge that's kind of built in there as well that you explore, which is really interesting. Was that intentional, or did that just sort of come out of the character developments?
Well, it was intentional because Caleb, try to picture this kid. He's got this wonderful gift. I mean, he's almost like a genius when it comes to how things go together and stuff. And they keep telling him. I mean, he has great joy. This brings him great joy by doing, oh, hey, let's say, look at this leaf, and this is the way it flies, and whatever. And when somebody tells you, well, what does a kid say all the time when they're growing up? Because we have 3 kids and we got 11 grandkids. So I know a little bit about this. But what's one of the biggest words they ever say? Why? Don't do that. Why? They'll want to know all the reasons. Well, in the society that Calix's in, he can't find any of that out until this ceremony, which is when they're 13. And there is a character in the book that goes through a ceremony, so you do find out what it is. But imagine how frustrating that is for this kid. He has this great joy. Let's say you love to this is much lesser, but let's say you love to play hockey, like I love to play hockey. What if my parents came along and said, no, we're not going to let you play that, and when I'll probably sneak out and go do it anyhow, because that's just the nature of kids when they're trying to figure out what the world is like. He knows he's got something really special. They let him put in the road, or they design the road, and everybody loved it. And it was like, well, why can't I do more of this sort of thing? But it's the whole society is clamping down on him. And then so we've all had things when we were growing up. I suppose I used some of that where people said, well, you can't do that. So that's why I think Calek is a really interesting character because he's almost clueless. It's like, I just don't get it. I want to find out about the old world. Well, you can't. It was evil. It was bad. It was, why can't I? What made it evil? Because just a few little intimations in his mind were like, that old world was probably pretty cool. They could do this or that. And why is it so bad? And so he doesn't get all the ramifications at that point.
Yeah, and it is interesting because you do navigate this really well, and how the two sides balance. So even in that side, with the progress of the old world, the pre-fall world, our world basically,
Yeah.
right? And you wonder, like with Calek, you can see Hezekiah's viewpoint because you know the old world collapsed, and yet you can see Calek's viewpoint because all of these things can benefit society. But you wonder, where's the slippery slope, right? Because there is a
Yeah.
slippery slope with technology. Where is that slippery slope
Yeah.
before you fall off the cliff, basically, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's the old thing is you can't put it back in the box. It's like I was just watching a documentary about the US and they talked about the atomic bomb and then Oppenheimer and they knew that if this is going to work, we're not going back, and we have this ability now to destroy the world maybe. And you can't. I mean, you could ban everything, but somebody else is going to come up with a way to do it. So that's sort of the question, like you say in this book too, is like, can you totally keep the old world at bay? So, and can you have a society where you went way back and stay that way? That's a hard one.
Yeah, and really you can't, because there is a segment of society that is just curious, basically. So I remember seeing a discussion on one of the Survivor episodes, and it happened to be, I think it was the men versus women one, but that's not really relevant for this. What happened on the men's side was that there was one guy, like they found a fishing net that was destroyed that they pulled out of the water. And there was one guy who was like really bent on trying to fix this. He just wanted to fix this net because he knew, like, if he could fix this net, they could catch food and everything. But everyone else was like, "You're wasting your time. You're just like, you're a detriment to the group, right?" But
Yeah.
he did manage to fix it, and it really benefited the group. But there's always, like, maybe, I don't know, 5-10% of the people who want to drive that way, and you can't really stop them. And it's sort of when it gets maybe too far, right? Because what I say is, double-edged sword of technology. It kind of gets sharper as the technology gets more advanced, doesn't it?
Oh, and it accelerates. I mean, I just can't believe in the last 20 years or so. I always think about that with science fiction that people would try to predict. You read the books from the 50s and the 60s. What's the future going to look like? And things keep coming out. Nobody predicted 9/11. Nobody predicted AIDS. Nobody predicted like the next big thing, whatever it's going to be. I always think that someday they'll come up with a transporter. If they can do that, that's going to revolutionize the world. If I can hop in a box and then I'm standing next to you a few minutes later, it'd be really something. But nobody knows what that's going to be. And once electricity was out there, and if Thomas Edison used it, they, even if you take that all away, people inherently know that there is a thing you could do this. We don't have to light these fires in the lanterns anymore. So it's a tough call. And in every stage, it's always been, well, this is really bad for humanity. I personally like my internet. I'm talking to you right now, and and I see your face, and it's pretty amazing, and you're thousands of miles away. So, but it's always you just don't know which one of these things is going to be what's going to really sink us, whatever it is. And there's something that maybe happens in Calek that maybe that's just that too far. We don't know.
Yeah. I wouldn't mind a teleporter. Then I could have a nice set here, and I could have my guests over. It'll talk one-on-one. Yeah. But yeah,
I would have.
AI is
I was,
basically our new nuclear option, isn't it? It does seem.
yeah.
And it's one of those things, exactly, like, it's a race at the moment, because if we don't do it, they're going to do it. Then they're going to get ahead of us, because it's such
Mhm.
an accelerator, basically, of everything.
Well, I love it because, like I said, I used zero AI to write my books and that sort of bugs me that people are using AI now to write whole books because I haven't. I worked really hard on my craft and my technique and make the words, but I can hold this up. This is the Calek book right here. I used AI to make the covers because it's great. I'm not an artist and I can't. You could hire somebody, but I don't even know what I want to look like. So I can go to AI and he'll give me all these examples of what cover, is that what you're looking for? And then you change this and change that. It works great. I mean, when I ask my phone a question about anything, like why are they mad at this player on the hockey team, and they'll say right away, it'll just come right up, and that's all AI. So I love it, but at the same time, how far is too far?
Yeah, AI is an interesting one, and I find it's amazing for research if you know how to use it effectively. And that leads to an interesting question that I have is some of the problems with technology, I mean, inherently us, not the technology, right? AI is an excellent example in that people use it very lazily and then they get caught out. Like we've seen all
Yeah,
these cases, right, where they get caught out, where all you have to do is, like, I was looking up something legally for a site I was signing up right now, and it gave me like, okay, this is the part you want. And I said, well, it's a legally binding document, so I better make sure, right? So, okay, can you
yeah,
give me the actual source information that I can look at myself? It's just things like that, right? Just double checking the information it gives you, a basic thing like that. But we just seem to get lazier and lazier with our technology as it gets
yeah.
more powerful, doesn't it?
Well, I remember arguing at parties back, and I remember in the 70s in college, where you'd sit at a party and you'd argue for an hour who did that song, and now you pick up your phone and go, who did, Itsy Bitsy Teeny Weeny Yellow Polka Dot Bikini, and in 10 seconds you got the answer. So, I mean, why wouldn't you use it? But
Yeah.
yeah, it's pretty crazy.
I was curious, before we get to the big questions, do you have any thoughts on future spin-offs for this series? Because it does seem to be a few, I mean, you pit sort of Hezekiah kind of represents sort of fundamentalist Christianity of a sort, but there are clearly other strong groups that could form foils as well in different ways. And if you had, I mean, not even with Calek necessarily, if his stories sort of wrapped up, but you could even investigate other stories throughout the world. Is there something that you're interested in, or is it sort of you're
Yeah.
happy with finishing it?
Oh, listen, I'd be happy if it got to be a bestseller, and then I'd be happy to write all kinds of sequels. I mean, look at the Hunger Games; she's still writing prequels and sequels, and I like the world that I created. So, sure, I'm not saying no to that, but I'm working pretty hard to try to get these books out there. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, you could do prequels, and as far as the another religious aspect, I'll let you read the other two books and see what you think. But
Yeah,
there is another side to this that's also spiritual, that I'd be curious. So when you do read it, please let me know what you think of book two and book three. So
definitely. So we are getting towards the end of our time, but I wanted to get into the big questions before I let you plug your
okay,
socials and stuff. So I've got a
all right,
couple
I'm
big
intrigued.
questions. They're wrapped around the same kind of issues. And so, okay, I'll start this way. The eternal challenge we seem to face as a society evolves is one of tradition versus progress, which is discussed in your book, which can be framed to some degree as right versus left, doesn't really matter. When and what to hold on to of the past, and when and how to move forward into the future. It seems determined to continue destroying empires, right? Empires rise and fall. They have massive progress, then they hold on to what worked, and then they collapse because they get rid of it. So something I've been wondering is whether the seeds of our empires, this rise and fall, so of our empire's destructions, which is pretty much all empires, whether these seeds are sown with the beginning of the empire, because we have this huge rush which puts certain people in places, and the more you look into that, the more frightening it is, and also certain ideas within society. And then those, like we see now, right? Reparations coming back for all the damage that we did as our empire was rising. Do you think that's the case, that the seeds of the empire's fall are sown into the beginning of the empire?
Boy, that's a big one. We could talk about hours on that one, but and like I said, I did study history. Um, yeah, it's hard to see how I think about this in terms of America with the because we did awful things to the Native Americans. We broke treaties. We did all kinds of things. I'm not a conspiracy guy that thinks we deliberately infected them with smallpox and that sort of thing. But I've always thought, what happens when a technologically advanced society moves into a less technologically advanced? You're not going to, it's hard to say this without sounding weird, but you're not going to have 300 million people living as nomads, wandering around killing the buffalo, so it's sort of like was inevitable what was going to happen in New Zealand, same thing with the natives and Australia and all those other places. So as far as the seeds being sown, that we're going to come back one day and say, well, we were terrible people, and and then that really cancels out everything else we've done. I mean, the founding fathers in America had slaves. Thomas Jefferson had slaves. I've been to Monticello and went, saw the slave quarters and the whole thing, and they did a good job presenting that. But that doesn't cancel out all the good things, that Thomas Jefferson did, and the Declaration of Independence. So I'm not sure what you're asking. Did that sow the seeds for America to be destroyed at this point because people don't believe that we're a good country
Yeah,
anymore?
I don't
That's
mean
what
like morally. I'm just wondering if the
okay.
actions sort of build up to a point where, like, people are questioning the past, and they're hyper focused on the bad parts of the past. Essentially, I completely agree with you that it's always a double-edged thing, right? Like even with England, we're facing this right now, and you could say, okay, well, we went into India and we did horrible things in
Yeah,
India and China as well. But in a lot of colonies, we built infrastructure as well. And I say we, I'm not British, but well,
right.
ancestrally I might be. But but the point is, like, England went into those countries. They built infrastructure that allowed the countries to develop, but they also did terrible things to the people. And so there's that two sides of it. But I'm also wondering, like, some of the people. So just thinking of some of the stuff that I've been reading about, not necessarily the leaders, although some of them as well. But you get like, okay, so one thing I was just reading right now is the sort of Satanist background of Jack Parsons, who founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, right?
I
So
never heard of that one.
yeah, there's an article in the Telegraph from 2017 which detailed a lot of it, and it's there's a lot of people in power who formed very influential organizations that one could argue are positive, but came from really negative backgrounds or very negative viewpoints to start those things. And so I don't know, it just seems to be a lot of, I'm waffling a lot now here, but it feels like
Yeah,
there's a lot of seeds in the chaos started in the beginnings of these empires that comes back around to haunt them in the end.
well, what I see is just as far as empires, and this is a really broad statement, but let's say you start out with a society and they don't have enough food, and so then they finally figure they got enough food, and then there's like a pyramid. Like the number one thing for life is air. Like I said, if you don't get air, you can last for about a minute, and so then you get enough air, then you have to get enough food, then you have to get enough water, and then you're looking for security, you're looking for safety, and it just blossoms and blossoms and blossoms. But at some point people start taking it for granted, and they don't fight really hard. If you got this little community and you had to fight off the bad guys from the outside, that's going to bind you all together. But then if, let's say you defeat the bad guys and your society gets bigger and bigger, pretty soon you're going to start arguing all these other things. What are we going to, how are we going to be fulfilled? What's the best way we can, and then you're going to argue about it and fight among each other. And the next thing you know, I mean, well, you're talking empires. The Roman Empire lasted what, 500 years, but the seeds are always in there as far as discontent. And what's weird now is that some of the things that, like the very conservative things, like the Hezekiahs and things like that, they have some real appeal because we all have. Um, there was an old, this is really a weird tangent. There was an old Monkey song called Shades of Gray. It was easy then to tell right from wrong, easy then to tell weak from strong, when a man should stand and fight or just go along. But today there is no day or night. Today there is no black and white, only shades of gray. And when somebody comes along, like in these cults, and says, this is it, this is what God wants to do, and I am the one to do it, there's a real appeal to that. And to think you're the only people in the whole world that have the real answer, because it gets really, really complicated. And then eventually, I mean, hopefully not anytime soon, but societies will collapse because, and usually they'll go towards a dictator or they'll go towards a crazy religious guy or something, whatever it is. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, definitely to a degree. I mean, I find it interesting, like you, I've been listening to some of the old songs and looking at sort of stuff from the 60s, 70s, 80s in light of modern times, and seeing like they saw stuff back then that we now see openly. Like, so it was
Yeah.
already starting back then, the visible collapse to some people. And it makes me wonder, is there something fundamental we haven't figured out yet? Which I guess kind of leads me into my second set of questions, which is, in your perspective, do you think we can reverse the current decline? Should we even try? Should we just let reality take its course and whatever comes after us is gonna come after us?
I'd have to say I've always been an optimist, but I get in trouble. I used to hang out with buddies and they started calling me Mr. Sunshine. But because I studied history, and people say, "Oh, this is the worst time it's ever been." Oh, really? What if you lived in Germany in World War II and your town is rubble now? And what if whatever it is? But and I think things are pendulum. The pendulum always swings. I'm old enough to see it swing a lot of times back. And I talked to my wife about this, and there's one thing that I've learned because I talk to a lot of people on the road. I'm a very interested person in a lot of other people's lives. I'm curious what their lives are like and what they think. And one of the things that I came to a conclusion of is nobody's got it made. And it looks like I do a show for some rich guy in a big house somewhere, and boy, he's got it made. He's got a beautiful family, nice house. But then you really talk to them, and they got stuff they're really dealing with, and real trouble, and they're stressed out. And I mean, how many really rich people have committed suicide? So, but if you look in every decade of history, we tend to think, oh, the 50s, that was a golden time because
Yeah.
it was like, oh, it was like happy days, and it was all everybody, women knew what their role was, and men knew what their role was. Go back and study the history of the 50s. Heck, there was atomic bombs they were worried about, and the civil rights movement, and all kinds of conflict everywhere. And then so I don't see that things are so terrible now. I really hate the division that we have. I'm not going to say what side of the political aisle I'm on, but I can talk to people on the other side and we don't call names and we can discuss. And I can see your point. That's gone away because the social media and people say you can't say that because you're this or you're that. I am pretty optimistic that the pendulum does swing. When it goes too far one way, then people kind of hold it back. Okay, just a minute now, let's try. And then it comes from over here and over there. And it's been the case everywhere in America and Canada and UK. And when you have a dictator, then they clamp it down and you don't get those swings probably, but eventually they'll fall.
Yeah, it is an interesting thing with nostalgia, first of all,
Oh, yeah.
that we're seeing, right? I mean, musically, the 80s seem to be taking off, probably because I don't know, maybe the baby boomers or maybe Gen X is in that
Yeah.
generation. I don't know. But then in terms of social structure, yeah, I mean, a lot of the people, which would be on the right, the more traditional side, are looking back, like say at the 50s, right? Oh, the wonderful 50s. And you're like, yeah, maybe it was for some people, or maybe it was in hindsight
Not
for
for
some
everybody.
people. But like the women of the 50s, if you look at the advertisements for example, I mean, we couldn't even the most fundamentalist person now would cringe at some of this stuff. I
Yeah.
remember reading one just as an example, and it's basically like, oh, if your man is not loyal, if he's looking at your secretary too much, maybe it's because you smell, right? Like it's literally just coming right out. And you're like, no, is it? So it's no
Yeah, you
wonder
really
that
cringe.
it's no wonder that feminism rose in the 60s because they came from that basically being
Yeah.
told that stuff. But yeah, no, it's really interesting to look and see, like I was listening to a comedian today who was commenting on the commentary around Trump and saying, "Oh, there's never been a less presidential president." And you're like, "Well, you don't remember Bill Clinton's issues in the 90s, right? That wasn't too long ago, right?"
How about Warren G. Harding?
Yeah, there's so
Yeah,
many of them, right?
he was not prepared. Yeah, but
Yeah.
yeah, there's one thing I would say too. And this is Mr. Optimist talking again, but and I can say this personally from the music business. People, I'm not one of those guys that go, "Oh, the music was the greatest in the '60s," and that stuff sucks now. I don't say that at all. But the really great thing for independent guys like me is I can put my music out there. I just had 20,000 streams in one of my songs and Spotify. And in the old days, if you didn't have a record company, you weren't going to do that. You can print up some records and go to a record store. But now it's a mass market. And I always say this, if you love Yugoslavian zither music, you can find a website and there's thousands of other people that love Yugoslavian zither music, and you can sell your music to them, and so there's so many. It used to be, the radio, the program lists were really, I mean, there's payola and they were really corporate, and we can only play these songs and these songs. I remember the FM was really cool. FM at midnight, jocks could play whatever they wanted, and I would listen, in bed and go, wow, that's really a cool song. They play Pink Floyd or something or whatever it was. But nowadays it's wide open. Anybody can find and same with books. And that was the other thing too. If you didn't get a major publisher, you're probably not getting anywhere. So there's so many good things. And hopefully we can iron out some of these other things. But I think it's a good time to be alive. It really is.
Yeah, I do agree that the technology has opened up a lot for us. It's a matter of navigating it, which presents some people challenges, but the potential is huge, isn't it?
Yeah. And I'm not the old guy that, doesn't believe in cell phones or anything like that. I embrace all of it just because I run websites and I do things. So I'm just, I never want to take it for granted. I remember my mom saying one time, you can get on a plane in Chicago and go to LA and that's really great. And then instead we get people complaining because, it's a cattle call when you get on the plane. So I tend to look at things as pretty darn good.
Well, I think that's a very positive note to end on. So it has
Great.
been great chatting with you. But we'll leave it at that high note. And
Sounds good. Yeah.
before we go, perhaps you could remind us if you have anything coming up or what your promotional schedule is like, where we can find you online.
Yeah, well, the best thing for me is my website is waynefaust.com, and that's generally for my music. And then my schedule, like how much of your audience is in the States. But I play in Missouri for 7 weeks in the summer. But that also has lots of details about me. And if you go to YouTube and search for Wayne Faust Best Videos, there's about 25 of my songs and videos. But as far as the books, which is what prompted this whole thing, I have an author's website. It's waynefaustauthor.com, WAYNEFAUST author.com. And then, of course, there's links to where to get all my stuff. Everything's on Amazon and Google Play. And you mentioned the audiobooks. Everything's pretty much everywhere. You can get it. If you search for Wayne Faust online, you find tons of things right away. So that's that thing you can do these days to get things all over the place. And you don't even have to, I don't have to pay Google to get my stuff on there. I don't have to pay Amazon to carry my stuff. And it's all pretty great.
Yeah, excellent. Wayne Faust, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Edwin. It's been awesome.
And thank you for listening. Information and links related to this and all episodes are available at alternatefutures.co.uk. I'm also over at Substack under Alternate Futures, where I post articles on science fiction, socio-technological issues, and futurism. You can subscribe for free or sign up for a paid account if you'd like to support the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not share it with friends, writers, and other sci-fi fans you know? And if there are any indie sci-fi creators you'd like to see featured, send me a message at podcast@alternatefutures.co.uk. Once again, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me on the next episode.
This is the future. Human error. Evolution. This is the future.